All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the seminar, especially because it's at a different time. Really appreciate it. I am in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the moment, where I'm in the second to last year of my PhD in history. And I'm actually also an alum of the UCT history department. I did my undergrad, finished in 2008, and then my honors in 2009. So it's really nice to get to come back to the UCT community. So what I'm going to be presenting today is based on a chapter of my PhD thesis. It's the first chapter of my thesis. And so I'd really value your comments as I'm still working on it. I'm going to give you also an outline of where this chapter fits in with the rest of the dissertation, in case that's helpful. So I just want to begin with a little bit of grounding to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is titled Imaginings of Collective Property Ownership in South Africa, the Beginning of the Native Farmers Association. Colonialism and apartheid, successive white-run governments sought to actively exclude Black South Africans' land rights from legal recognition. For most of the 20th century, the South African state imposed a kind of racialized legal division, individual title deeds for white people and communal land under chiefs for Black people. In this chapter, I address how Black farmers and lawyers in rural South Africa in the early 20th century, from around 1905 to 1925, developed imaginaries of collective property ownership that I think offered alternatives to the very narrow kinds of property law that were recognized by the state at the time, and indeed, I think throughout the apartheid period. So this chapter is based on a couple of years of dissertation research involving oral history interviews and research in both official and family archives. And as I said, it also serves as the first chapter of my PhD thesis. My thesis as a whole focuses on a history of collective property ownership in 20th century South Africa, looking specifically at land. One of the challenges I've set myself in this thesis is to study not only how people conceived of property through official law, but also how Black farmers articulated ideas about property and community outside of the realm of official law. So the first chapter that I'm presenting here examines the emergence of a particular land buying collective developed by Black farmers on the farms of Driefontein and Daggakraal in what was then the Transvaal province in the north of South Africa. And in this chapter, I explore some of the property debates and practices that circulated during this period, including the inputs of lawyers like Pixley Seme and women intellectuals like Monsisi and Pueto. So just to give you a sense of how the rest of the thesis looks and where this chapter fits in. So as I said, this is the first chapter, which goes up until the 1920s, looking at the formation of the Native Farmers Association. Chapter 2 looks at the financial arrangements and credit practices that Black farmers involved in the Native Farmers Association used to either buy up further land or for transactions or to hold onto their land. In chapter 3, I intend to examine how the land buyers in the NFA conceptualized and implemented some joint agricultural schemes and strategized to stave off evictions during the period of high apartheid, so roughly the 1950s to the 1970s. Chapter 4 looks at the work of Black women's church groups, sometimes called manyanos, and how those groups facilitated spaces through which women could organize against impending forced removals and also reimagine different roles for themselves on land management committees and when it comes to land ownership. The final chapter of the thesis, chapter 5, looks at the emergence of new juristic entities in the late 1980s and early 1990s, forged by land activists, lawyers, land claimants, and NGOs through struggles against forced removals. So some of these entities are now called communal property associations and community trusts, and they're very common in South Africa's land restitution program. I came across these entities when I was working at the Land and Accountability Research Center at UCT in UCT's law faculty where we were doing a lot of work with land restitution claimants, looking at issues that they faced. So I think it would be unwise to draw a straight line between what I'm looking at in chapter 1, between land buying syndicates such as the Native Farmers Association and the communal property associations that we see in the 1990s. But I do think there are some continuities, some ideas that survived and were developed by Black land buyers, which will be useful not only to historians, but also, I hope, to policymakers and government officials interested in land reform. So the section I'm presenting here focuses specifically on a debate about forms of land ownership between 1912 and 1925 in Driefontein and Daggakraal. In these areas, farmers had come from around the country and bought into a land buying scheme run by lawyer and ANC founder Pixley. The scheme was managed through Seme's company called the Native Farmers Association, and I'm going to refer to it as the NFA for ease of reference here. What I'd really like to talk about here is that Seme had a very particular vision for how the NFA should pan out. For him, this was an opportunity to create a sense of freedom through entrepreneurship, to build a community around land buying. But Seme's vision was not the only one driving the project. The families that bought into Seme's vision, or Seme's scheme, I should say, often contested the notions of community and property that Seme had in mind in his vision. And I think the clashes between Seme and the other land buyers in the NFA offer some insights into debates about property and law taking place amongst Black farmers in the early 20th century. So some of you may be familiar with Daggakraal and Driefontein already. These were key sites of protest against forced removals in the 1980s. I think they make for a particularly interesting case study because most of the descendants of the original land buyers who bought into the NFA scheme in 1912 still own land there today. The apartheid government referred pejoratively to Driefontein and Daggakraal as black spots, by which they meant land owned by Black people in a sea of otherwise white-owned farmlands. And Driefontein was the site of very intensive activism against forced removals, which was ultimately successful in staving off removal. What you see here are some images from the 1980s, photographs from Gilles de Vlieg, of meetings called to resist the removals. The one on the top is Enos Mabuza speaking to a group, and the one on the bottom, Solom Kize, who in around 1983, I think, was murdered by a white policeman at a meeting to organize the protests against forced removal. So Driefontein is now called Solom Kizeville in Solom Kize's honor. So now to take us back in time again to the founding of the Native Farmers Association. There's an origin story that people in Driefontein and Daggakraal tell about how they came to own their land there. They say that in 1911, there was a horse race that took place in what's now Daggakraal on the land of a white farmer. White and Black horse owners gathered together for the race, and a sizable crowd developed to watch. According to Daggakraal-born Catherine Madlala, whose grandparents told her the story, owning a horse during that period was not necessarily a sign of high status, as it may have been in England at the time, as we see from a number of theories about England during that period. So when the winning horse crossed the line at this race in 1911, a dispute ensued. The winning horse was owned by two Black farmers named Lunyolo Ngwenya and his brother Nshebe. But the white horse owners refused to recognize this victory. Instead, they declared a horse owned by a white farmer to be the winner. The Ngwenya brothers complained about this, and when they did so, two of the white farmers' horse owners beat them up. The Ngwenya brothers took their assailants to court in Volksrust, and it was at this point that Pixley Kaseme, according to the stories that people tell, came onto the scene. Seme was a lawyer, businessman, and founder of the ANC, as I said, in 1912. So during this case, he assisted the Ngwenya brothers in court, but they had little joy there. And so Seme suggested that if the brothers were to have a haven to race horses and do other things, that could not be on white land. And so it was, people say, that Black farmers from around the country came together under Pixley Seme's leadership to buy into this collective landholding scheme called the NFA. Seme's land buying scheme took place at a moment that I think is often lost in some grand narratives of South African history. This was a moment when possibilities for Black farmers to be prosperous seemed possible, albeit very difficult. Due to settler pressure, in 1903, the government had barred Africans from buying crown land, but they were still allowed to buy private land from white farmers, at least in this part of the Transvaal. After the South African War, many Afrikaner farmers were struggling economically and looking to sell their property, and it's likely that this is how Willem Goos came to sell his land to Pixley Seme in 1912. Goos was also aware of the Ngwenya brothers, and so there was some relationship going far back there. And so Daggakraal farm was the first purchase that the Native Farmers Association made in the Transvaal. Seme established the NFA with the express purpose of buying up land to sell and rent to Black farmers. The NFA bought 4 farms in total in what was then the Transvaal province, all in what was then the Wakkerstroom district. They bought Daggakraal, Driefontein, Driefontein, and Vlakplaats. These farms, as I said, were all situated outside what had then been declared the native reserves. The purchase also took place, as you all note, in 1912, 1 year before the notorious 1913 Land Act, which made it even more difficult for Black South Africans to own land in the form of titles. Seme was aware of debates about impending legislation, and he saw the NFA as a means to acquire and protect Black South African land in a context where the government, together with the growing class of white farmers, sought to dispossess them of land and livelihoods. Seme and his colleagues solicited land buyers by word of mouth and in newspapers like Abantu Bato, which was owned by Seme, and Ilanga La Senatel. People sold their livestock, pooled resources, and also took out loans in order to finance their purchases at Daggakraal and Driefontein. These purchases usually ranged between 200 and 600 pounds. Families came from Natal, Free State, Swaziland, and various parts of the Transvaal to buy into this scheme. And among the arrivals at Daggakraal were the Ngwenya brothers who had been involved in the horse race. The NFA was known as a syndicate. This is a term used both by officials and by some Black land buyers themselves in the early 20th century. It was not the only syndicate in the country at the time. Many land syndicates were founded, for example, in Natal in the latter half of the 19th century. But regulations on Black land ownership there had tightened. And so a lot of people from Natal came over to the Transvaal, employing again the syndicate model in the hopes of buying and protecting their land. So there were syndicates that were set up all over the Transvaal province, what's now Limpopo and Mpumalanga, Northwest, and so on. And I think considering that for most of the 20th century, Black South Africans were virtually forbidden by the government from buying land, the situation of syndicates is really fascinating. So how did Seme manage to buy land in the Transvaal, and how did Black farmers then manage to keep it? This story is a fascinating one, the story of the legal strategy that Seme employed. I don't have time to go into it here, but it is something that I discuss in the dissertation. And I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A and discussion. It's also something that's covered in more detail in 2 brilliant books, one by Bongani and Kulunga, which is about a biography of Seme, and the other by Tembeka and Tsukaitobi, whose book is called The Land is Ours. What I would really like to focus on and get your feedback on during this presentation are the debates that broke out between the farmers and Seme as to which form of property ownership would be best for them to take on. So Seme had a very particular vision, as I said, for the NFA, and it was influenced by his grounding in a particular kind of liberal political thought. Seme believed, and I'm quoting here from the Memorandum of Understanding, the articles in the preamble to the Constitution of the NFA. So these were written by Seme. Quote, in educating the native mind as to the importance of economic interests in land and the advantage of individual land tenure over and above communal or tribal tenure, end quote. Like some of his Congress contemporaries, Seme was very influenced by the thought of Booker T. Washington, in particular his philosophy of self-help for African Americans. During his time as a student at Columbia University in the US, Seme had read Washington's work. He had also written numerous letters to Washington. He wrote to Washington in 1906, for example, telling him he was inspired by the Tuskegee School in Alabama, which emphasized industrial agricultural education. At a meeting of the SANC in 1911, Seme was vocal in proposing the establishment of agricultural colleges, quote, to train the natives in modern methods of agriculture, end quote. And this focus on agricultural industry was something that Seme was to bring in and attempt to permeate the NFA when he established it. So for Seme, the seeds of empowerment could be sown by a combination of individual land ownership, education about agriculture, and a common sense of purpose. In the same year that he founded the NFA in 1912, Seme also founded the newspaper Abantu Bato, and here you'll see some images from Abantu Bato in 1912. And he really kind of used Abantu Bato as a sort of platform for promoting the NFA. For instance, in an article in 1912, an unnamed writer expresses, quote, nowadays in civilization, no person is really a man if he possesses no land of his own, end quote. This was an article in Zulu, which I've translated. So another example of this kind of promotion of the ideals of the NFA came from John Dube, who was a fellow ANC founder and also a newspaper founder of Ilanga la Senatel. He writes an article in 1914 in Ilanga la Senatel, which was republished in Abantu Bato in Zulu, which describes Daggakraal as a place of abundance. He talks about it in really glowing terms. He describes a scene in which Black school children are playing during their break time, while Black teachers prepared the lessons, Black clergy preached to the churchgoers, Black farmers plowed the land, and Black families reaped the rewards. So through Abantu Bato, I think that Seme was attempting to bring land buyers and the wider reading public into his vision of land ownership-based empowerment. In one particularly interesting article in Abantu Bato, an editorial, Seme calls on particular Black intellectuals and somewhat well-off farmers and clergy people by name, encouraging them to come and join the NFA project, whether in Daggakraal or to think of buying land elsewhere. He notes that this is not only a Congress matter, so he calls for a wider group to join him. He says, this is not only a matter of politics, quote, but also a matter of business, end quote. It's interesting also that in his call for farmers to join the NFA, he doesn't only mention male farmers. He also calls upon some Black women, members of the intelligentsia, such as Angelina Sophia Kumalo, who herself believed in self-help schemes. Later, she was involved with Bertha Mkhize, with the Daughters of Africa, Christian Mutual Aid Group for Women. And also she was later to marry John Dube in the 1920s. So while it's clear that the majority of title deeds in Driefontein and Daggakraal, like other land buying syndicates such as Edendale in Natal, men were in the majority when it came to the names on title deeds. I think that the names on deeds, as other gender historians have written, often belies what was going on under the surface, where women played really key roles in decisions about land ownership and in debates about land ownership. And there's still more research that I hope to do on this, but amongst those who were commenting in newspapers at the time on land ownership were Adelaide Dube, Charlotte Makreke, and the poet Nomzimsi Nkwetho. In 1924, for example, Nkwetho wrote a poem which is called Something's Coming. And in this she says, quote, "Something's coming, we do well to buy land. The government made it crystal clear, you'll do your cooking perched on branches," end quote. So here she's really enjoining people to buy into the idea of land purchase. So although hundreds of farmers came and bought land through the NFA, they didn't necessarily buy wholesale into Seme's vision of community, into his political philosophy. What follows are two examples of how NFA members, I think, contested Seme's visions. And in so doing, they imagined and at times implemented forms of property ownership that neither mapped onto Seme's ideas of individual land holding, nor the government's idea of collective land ownership via chiefs. So the first example that I'd like to talk about is this debate about what was called in the legal parlance divided versus undivided shares. So Seme encouraged farmers involved in the NFA to buy land from the company in the form of divided shares. And this meant that each individual or family would buy a demarcated piece of land and have it in their own name. But most NFA members wished to hold land in what they called undivided shares. That is, managing and using some land in common with an agreement in place that certain families would have priority to certain plots. In the end, Driefontein and Daggakraal were divided into divided shares. But in practice, even those who acquired land via this way did so through some form of collective decision-making and in some cases, collective land holdings. The concept of undivided shares was common in the Transvaal at the time, in the early 20th century. For example, there was another farm in the Transvaal called Klipgat. The Ngakane family bought this farm in 1910 in undivided shares. In an interview with Morobane Ngakane, whose parents bought the farm, Ngakane states, quote, "As an undivided farm, everyone amongst us has the right to own it from one corner to another," end quote. So I think beneath this legal terminology of undivided shares and divided shares sits larger questions about class, community, and political subjectivity, which are worth interrogating. One of the ways of doing that for me is going back and looking at where the farmers who joined the NFA came from and the kind of intellectual worlds and economic worlds that they came from. So I like to turn to do that to an example from what was then the Natal province. So in Natal, there is a long tradition of individual land ownership amongst Black farmers, Edendale being one of the most prominent examples. Farmers in Edendale, other scholars have argued, like Sheila Menkes, were driven by principles of individual land ownership, cultivating intensely, and land ownership as a way to secure their status as respectable Christian citizens. So this is a very important school of thought, but I think there were other ideas also circulating in Natal between 1850 and the early 1900s. One example is another syndicate, also called Driefontein. This is a bit confusing, so I put it here on the slide because there are two Driefontein. So there's Driefontein, which was founded as a syndicate in Natal in 1867. And I think there's some interesting similarities between that Driefontein and the Driefontein founded by Seme in the Transvaal in 1912. So in Natal, Johannes Khumalo had led a breakaway group from Edendale to purchase the farm Driefontein in the Klip River area. And in the Natal Driefontein, members held land in undivided shares, as the people in Transvaal Driefontein had originally requested. They had some central common areas for grazing. They shared large plots, some large plots for farming, and they also had individual residential plots for families. Another similarity is that they had a committee to manage land administration. In the Transvaal in 1912, this is a feature of the history of Daggakraal and Driefontein. These land committees, rather than say traditional councils, which would make decisions about land management, handle inheritance matters, give new people the okay to move into the area, and so on. Seme grew up in Natal, and he would have been familiar with the various traditions of political thought regarding property in both Edendale and the Driefontein Natal. But as not only a thinker, but also a lawyer, politician, and businessman, Seme was ambivalent about which form of land tenure to allow within the NFA. On the one hand, he wanted his client's business. He wanted them to buy into it. But on the other, he felt it would undercut the NFA's strategy and arguments for land rights in what the government had termed white areas if they proposed a form of land tenure, undivided shares, which the government saw as inferior and indeed as threatening. By the time the NFA showed signs of financial strain by 1919, members were still debating at meetings which form of land holding they wanted to settle on. Later in 1919, the NFA was liquidated, and Seme was pushed out of any official involvement with the NFA by I.W. Schlesinger, the man whom Seme had approached to largely finance the NFA. Some buyers who had initially wanted to hold land in undivided shares had lost faith in the idea, possibly due in part to poor management by some members of the syndicate. For example, this was particularly a complaint amongst people who had come from Witzieshoek, an area near Harrismith in the Free State. They noted that they had paid more than their fair share of land in installments to purchase land, but that somehow it had been taken away from them simply because a man who they saw as their chief Maitse Molloy, had not kept up in paying his installments. And so when Schlesinger took over the company from Seme officially in 1923 and reissued some of the title deeds, divided shares won out amongst the buyers, with each family having individual plots. But I think the existence of a debate about the undivided shares survived in certain ways. For instance, in joint mills established by Driefontein residents for maize in the 1950s, individual aid associations that women participated in the 1970s and 80s, and in the ideas about collective property ownership that emerged out of the forced removal struggles in the 1980s and 1990s. The question of undivided shares also calls attention to the ways in which farmers developed and molded ways of managing property collectively. And these were ideas that didn't map onto reified notions of personhood and property advanced by either Seme or by white government officials in South Africa. So before concluding, the final example that I want to give is related to the group of buyers who came from the Harrismith region of the Free State. So they had bought land as a group of about 25 people, 25 families, I should say, in 1913. And they had come with a chief named Maitse Popo Molloy. They had bought land almost as a syndicate within a syndicate. So they bought land as a collective group within the larger NFA syndicate. And all of the members there had put money towards the purchase. But when Seme had signed the deed from the NFA to this Harrismith group, he had put the deed in the name of Chief Maitse Molloy alone. When Molloy himself defaulted on payments for the purchase of the land, Seme claimed the contract was broken and that everyone forfeited their rights to land. Seme justified this by stating, quote, "I know that an individual member of a tribe has no right to land. There is no individual tenure," end quote. Residents opposed this interpretation, arguing they bought land in the name of a group, not in the name of Chief Molloy, and all other group members had paid up. Seme's approach here seems to contradict his earlier advocacy of individual land titles. So how do we explain it? I think there are two possible interlinked explanations. First, perhaps Seme was in favor of individual land tenure when it suited him financially as a business person, but not when it didn't. Second, we know from other literature that Seme was genuinely sympathetic to chiefs and believed them to be key role players in his vision for building a united and prosperous land buying movement. For example, he was very close to the Swazi royal family, and he also played a major role in mobilizing chiefs to join the ANC. So it's possible that Seme was recognizing Chief Moloi, not only because it was strategic for him to do so as a businessman, but because he believed, at least in some cases, in the customary legitimacy of chiefs with regard to land functions. But as I said, in this argument that he made, Seme was challenged by members of the Native Farmers Association, people who had bought land alongside Chief Maitse Moloi. And a number of these voices emerged during a really interesting court case, a case of Case Dlamini versus Molapisi Sehlako. Sehlako was a member of the Harrismith group who bought land alongside Moloi in 1913, and he had paid up fully in installments for the land that he had purchased, that he felt he had purchased as part of the group. While he was gone for several months away from Daggakraal, another man arrived from Natal, Case Dlamini, and Seme issued this man a title to the same land owned by Molapisi Sehlako. When Sehlako came back, he was obviously very angry. Dlamini had already built a house on the land, and he disputed that Dlamini should own this land. He said that he had owned the land all along. In the court case around this dispute, in which Seme supported Case Dlamini and the Harrismith group rallied around Sehlako, Sehlako said, quote, "I went to Daggakraal to buy land for myself." Another of his supporters, Jonas Moloi, added, quote, "I know the native tribal customs. Daggakraal was not bought in the name of a chief. It was bought in the name of 24 men, and I was one of those men." Jonas Moloi argued that the NFA gave a receipt to the group that was in the name of Chief Moloi, but he was merely acting as a representative, not as the owner of the group, and that this has been, not as the owner of the land in the group, and that this has been understood by everyone. The Sehlako case, I think, is illustrative of the ways in which Black land buyers contested the categories imposed on them by both the government and Seme. Many people living in the Witwatersrand area were sharecroppers and did not swear strong allegiance to traditional leaders. In the Sehlako case, it's important to note, witnesses argue that Chief Maitse Moloi does play an important role in their community as a leader. It's just that he is not considered the sole owner of land or the sole decision maker. So to conclude, the 1911 horse race origin story that people tell about Daggakraal and Driefontein offers an example, I think, early on in the life of the Native Farmers Association of how Pixley Seme navigated the racist legal system of the time to the benefit of himself and his fellow land buyers. And it furthermore hints at Seme's vision for the NFA as not just a company, but an ideal community made up of Black farmers who had come from all over the country, speaking different languages, bringing with them different traditions of practice around land and political thought. Seme imagined the project that he pioneered in Daggakraal and Driefontein to spread throughout the country. As we know, this did not happen, not through a fault of his or the land buyers, but through consecutive attempts by white governments and white settlers to basically make it impossible for Black farmers to survive. Seme's project developed cracks in 1919 when the NFA was liquidated, so already then. But yet I think the committees and forms of governance that Black farmers in the NFA debated and developed as they created a new community have lived on in Daggakraal, Driefontein, and other parts of South Africa. And I think they're really interesting to take account of when we think of the history of African farmers' forms of political thought and practices during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These images just give you a sense of Daggakraal and Driefontein. Today, they're very poor. Most people are unemployed. It became impossible to make a living from farming. But some of the heroes, who they consider at least the heroes of their struggles, are still Solom Kize, Pixley Seme. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions.
Thanks, Tara. Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. We have about a good 20 minutes. Sorry, I forgot to introduce you, but I'm sure you did obviously a much better job than I would have.
That's okay.
But it's a small group today. I was a little worried about the number of people. Anyway, so the floor is open. Please go. You can put up your hands, on that using that app, or just can turn on your video and ask the question, whatever works for you. The light. Lloyd, please go ahead, Lloyd. If you could, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, Lloyd, please go ahead.
It's okay. Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Well, I just have one question. Well, I'm still trying to formulate my other questions, but the first question is, I just want to know the quality of land that Seme was getting for the people, because I just want to see or know how much it was, because I mean, if it was of good quality, maybe it would have been more expensive. Yeah, exactly. Because also my question is based on what happened in Zimbabwe, like in the 20th. Yes, I think yes, in the 20th century, where land was being sold like on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, but then the land that was available was of bad quality, and the people that got it really didn't yield much from it. So I just wanted to find out if it was the case. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Lloyd. If I don't see any more hands right now, but so Tara, why don't you respond to that, and maybe we'll come back to other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd, for those great questions. I would be interested just to hear, in Zimbabwe, what period are you referring to when the willing seller, willing buyer process was happening in Zimbabwe? Was it more recently, or was it around the same time?
No, it wasn't in the same period. It was at a later time, actually. It was at a later time, but yes, yeah. But then just out of interest, I just wanted to, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so as far as I understand from what people tell me through oral history interviews, what they remember, they rarely speak about that early period, the first half of the 20th century in Driefontein, as being a time of great abundance in terms of produce from the land. So people were farming maize, sorghum, sweet potato, I think. So it sounds to me, and I'm visiting there as well, that the land was of fairly good quality, and certainly was something which skilled farmers, which were many of the arrivals in Driefontein and Daggakraal, could really make a go of. So Driefontein and Daggakraal were really portrayed as a sort of haven for Black farmers to come and make a living off of farming. The idea was that this would sustain them on its own. They would be able to avoid wage labor, which was already obviously in play in South Africa by 1912. But so I think it was less the quality of the land than the situation that meant that it was so difficult to make a living as the decades passed. So as the decades passed, they became squeezed in terms of market access as this haven of Black farmers within like a sea of white-owned commercial farmland. And in addition to that, when people began to not being able to make a living off the land, they had to take on tenants. And so labor tenants who were evicted, and farm workers who were evicted from various parts of the Transvaal all sought out Driefontein and Daggakraal, and became the tenants of these Black landowners. And so that led also to a lot of kind of overuse of soil and to real challenges in the size of people's farming plots. So people talk about that process as being what led to it becoming impossible to make a go of farms. But I think, unlike, as you correctly point out in Zimbabwe history, but also in South Africa's current land reform program, often I've seen people being offered land that is just like impossible to farm, whether it's stock farming or agriculture. So this seems like this land was actually quite rich.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for the question. Other question, comments? Bodhi, you can go ahead.
Hi, Tara. This is fascinating, and I'm particularly struck by some of the strange kind of overlaps between what I do in a very different part of the world almost a century ago. So it's not so much focused on the empirical materials that you presented, which I'm still processing them, but a slightly kind of larger comparative question or conceptual, however you want to treat it. Precisely because if I didn't mishear you, you also mentioned that there is a place in your thesis in some subsequent chapter about the judicial implication of it all, right? And I'm trying to think that how this individuation of the peasant, right, kind of extracting it from a whole series of productive and other relationship. Are you also kind of considering how this individuated, extricated peasant figure gets linked to a larger judiciary kind of apparatus in terms of fixing both liability and culpability in terms of revenue and taxes and so on and so forth? And so I'm just, it's not a very well-formed question because it just triggered a lot of ideas. But I would like to hear you think aloud about the possibility of a figure of right and a figure of responsibility, right? And the kind of legal crystallization of it all on a seemingly kind of economic terrain. I don't know if you have been thinking about this or not, but this is what it triggered in me, and I would be just interested in hearing your thoughts.
This is a really good question. Something I have to think about a little more, but I'll give a stab at thinking it through here. So I think one of the things that's been challenging about this has been it's because there's more written by Seme and about Seme, it's easier for me to get a sense of the kind of legal subject that Seme had in mind walking through the NFA and being part of the NFA. This Christian, sometimes educated, but not necessarily, because he also appealed to sharecroppers and labor tenants to come and join. He said even farmers who have small savings could come and join him. So there's to some extent a class-based aspect to it, but it seems like Seme was also trying to build a wider ideal community of Black farmers. But in Seme's mind, there's a clearer sense of what these subjects would be, these sort of Christian rights-bearing citizens, rights-bearing to land, ideally also having the vote, and that this would be the path to kind of Black liberation. So this is kind of, and Seme as a lawyer was very well versed in how to navigate the loopholes in the law, and he was able to use the law, like just to give an example of how he used it effectively. So initially, the white farmers in the surrounding areas complained to the local magistrate about the NFA, and so the local government tried to have the NFA disbarred, and they used the squatters law of 1875 to say that Seme, as the kind of owner of this company, as a Black person, could not give out passes to people, could not recognize them as squatters on his land, because that's what Seme had been doing with an awareness of the squatters law. Seme came back and said, but this is not an individual, this is a company. And in law, the company is not racialized. And the magistrate had to agree with him on a matter of law and said that companies are not yet racialized in South African law. And so they agreed. Government ministers talk about being defeated by Seme through his legal arguments. But then I think that the part that's more challenging is to try and figure out the other members of the Native Farmers Association, because I don't want to make the assumption that they had in mind the same kinds of legal subjectivities that they were aspiring to. It's easier to figure out how the state viewed them, and how the state viewed them was the state didn't like either Seme's philosophy or the Undivided shares philosophy. So they saw both as very threatening. They clamped down on individual landholders. They saw that as a kind of insurgent kind of citizenship, but they also clamped down on people who wanted to own land through syndicates. They said, this is not a tribe. It's not even individual land tenure. It's not, where are you getting these ideas, you know? And I looked to see whether there was evidence of sort of people consulting Marxist texts in socialism, but I couldn't really find that. So I'm still trying to get to the bottom of how people viewed themselves, even though it's clearer how the state viewed them.
Can I, sorry, Anandaru, can I,
Yeah,
if there's not a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just fascinated by this, because maybe one interesting thing to think here is, because you are rightly kind of, I find the same thing with particularly when the joint stock company form begins to be very imaginatively deployed by different parts in the colonized world. And it is around 1914, actually, in the shadow of the Great War, one way of basically grounding this company idea, right, which is still unracialized, which is still kind of, you know, that notion of the Teflon undying individual, the legal individual of the company, who is not inflected by race or place. During the Great War, one kind of particular thing that happens across the empire is basically beginning to insist on the domicile question. Right, so whether a company is, because that's when the whole situation, what the war exposes, you know, if English joint shareholders of a German joint stock company, what happens then, right? Because what is enemy property during the war? The war basically kind of reveals that thing. So that might be kind of exactly an area to perhaps, I don't know, now or later, to think about how the company's kind of abstract legal subjectivity gets translated into specified subjectivity that can be ruled over by Dominion sovereign. So that's just like something I'm interested in, and I'm just kind of very glad to see a fellow traveler. But the other kind of issue that I'm also thinking is perhaps to think about the corporate subjectivity of law, because this is also the time that customary law is undergoing a very interesting change, right? And we often do not realize that this kind of idea of share and corporate holding actually stretches across university, where in fact initially in the 13th, 14th century this law was first made in Europe. University, kind of joint stock company, and forms like agricultural cooperatives, right? So I'm just kind of trying to think a little bit about the legal forms and figurations of these fantasies, and how interestingly Seme can use them and still kind of, you know, operate within a native chief kind of paradigm. No, sorry, I'm just interested. And great work,
really
like
useful
really
to think
enjoyed.
with. Thank you. That's very, very useful to think with. Appreciate that. Yeah.
Thanks, Bodhi. Yeah, I was thinking similarly around the form of the company, but you know, I can come back later. Other questions, comments? Sean, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't figure the line. You mentioned oral history several times. I'm just more. I mean, did you conduct the interviews or did you draw on oral history collections? So you conducted the interviews.
A combination of
Who
both.
did you interview? What were how did the field work take place? I'm very curious.
Sure. So definitely some of what I rely on are others' interviews, mostly Charles van Onselin's The Project with interviews with sharecroppers and so on. But yeah, I did around maybe 30 to 40 interviews with people in Daggakraal and Driefontein, mostly people whose grandparents or great-grandparents had bought land in 1912. Sorry, have I frozen?
No,
you're back now. You're back.
Okay. Yeah, so I conducted interviews with mostly sort of older people, predominantly gogos, whose grandparents or great-grandparents bought land as part of Seme's scheme. And it was a combination of people whose families came from Natal and the Free State. And so that's where this origin story of Daggakraal and Driefontein, this horse race story, emerged. And also with a lot of these people had also been very involved in the anti-forced removal struggles. So it's a combination which becomes really important in some of my later chapters. For instance, the chapter on women's organizing. So some of the women I interviewed were very, very involved in the ANC underground. And that was their main kind of form of sociality and secret kind of organizing. But then there seems another group who didn't associate themselves with political activity per se, because they said they wouldn't be able to get much done if they did that. They were scared of what would happen. And so they were more involved in church groups, in manyanos and so on, but also organized politically through that way, just not in as open a political way as a political party.
Okay, thanks. Time for more.
Thanks, Tara. We still have.
And I should say the interviews. So my Zulu is not very. My Zulu is not fluent. So I went along with someone who helped me, Snangidi, a Wit student, because otherwise it would have been impossible to get at some of people's understandings of land ownership and so on. I think that attentiveness to language is essential.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. If anybody, if others don't have a question, I don't see a hand up. I'll then, I have many questions that I'm sure we'll talk later. But thank you for joining us and for making time. It's a wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to the PhD and the book whenever it is out. I'm just curious to draw on what Bothi has already asked you. I was just wondering about the form of the NFA as a company, and it's very interesting that you say that the company aspect of it comes out when Pixley Seme is negotiating the existing legal apparatus or legal system. I'm also interested in how people see it as a company, people who are investing in it. What kind of, what legally as well, in terms of what kind of form, particularly what I know you're drawing on the Natal model a little bit, and I'm just curious also in terms of the word syndicate, because while you talk about the regional models from which the syndicate idea is drawn, but the syndicate idea is already there globally in a multifarious form. So I'm also curious about, I'm sure that will be a part of that conversation, how they're drawing on the global syndicate, or does it at all come into play, that kind of conversation. And also this is just coming from a place of curiosity and ignorance, is that how exactly does the undivided share work in practice? I see a very interesting kind of moment or a possible moment in terms of thinking about property between individual tenure and collective property holding under the chief. And in undivided shares seem to be working as that sort of the historians stab at the future policy in terms of, but I'm curious about how it worked in terms of practice. And also, finally, I thought that, it's very interesting because Tembeka's book actually retains a certain homogeneity in terms of Black constitutionalism in the early 20th century. Your work is actually showing something much more, I think, interesting in terms of the fractured nature of that Black constitutionalism, especially when it comes to property. I mean, at the level of idea and solidarity and political solidarity, it's something which, I mean, which we know in post-apartheid South Africa, that's easy, not easier, but that's something which has been assembled. But when it comes to property, the different fractures kind of come out in it. So I was wondering if you were also thinking of that moment of fractured Black constitutionalism, especially when you actually read it through the lens of property. You don't have to respond to all of it now, but my scattered thoughts for the time being, but there's a lot more. I'm sure we'll talk. Again, thank you for the time and excellent project.
Yeah. These are fantastic questions, and really interesting. Your first question about the company and syndicates. So firstly, besides what Seme and Dube and others were drawing on in terms of Black thoughts in the US and African-American mutual aid societies and agricultural companies, I haven't dipped much into syndicates elsewhere. So I would be grateful for suggestions of more global ideas that were developing at the time around syndicates. How the company worked and how people bought into it is really interesting, because people express a lot of confusion in their meetings with Seme between around 1913 and 1920 in terms of in what capacity they actually own land in the company, because a lot of people thought they were buying title deeds and that these title deeds would be issued by the government. But some people found that they were issued deeds from the NFA, so rather than from the government. So that the title deeds remain in the name of the Native Farmers Association. So clearly what Seme was doing was he bought a whole lot of land through financing, from taking out loans, amongst others, from this businessman, I.W. Schlesinger. And then he was like subcontracting and reselling some of that land to others that I discuss in a later chapter. He was actually selling it at a higher price. So he was also making a profit off of these sales. So people were paying in installments for the land because they couldn't afford it in one lump sum. Yeah. And they were paying in installments with very high interest rates, much higher interest rates than, one of the challenges is that in general, there weren't formal avenues for Black people to take out loans. So it's hard to figure out what interest rates would have been, but certainly higher interest rates than white people were paying for bank loans, for example. So then people said, well, what are we? Are we shareholders? Are we owners? And so there's a lot of confusion about that. And maybe that's something that I need to, maybe it's a subject for another chapter actually that I need to explore. How did undivided shares work in practice? Great question, something I'm trying to figure out. Because in Driefontein and Daggakraal, you kind of have a sense from oral histories of how it happens, but not really from the archives. So even though people own land in divided shares, the way people talked about land ownership was that they said, well, in 1950 something, we pooled resources and developed this mill because we didn't want to go to that white farmer's land to have the maize and develop it for millie meal and stuff. Like we wanted to have so definitely were involved in joint projects, and people also, even though they had divided shares, people would allow others to use some of their farming land if others were, say, in a period of great need, and also if others had assisted them in some form of, like for instance, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of labor tenants were given land and were treated very much better by the landowners because they felt the labor tenants were really aiding them in the struggle against forced removals. So struggles against political struggles seem to in some ways give people rights to land and not only economic capacity and so on. So yeah, basically it's something that needs more exploration. And then, yeah, I think your comment about the more fractured nature of sort of Black thought on the issue of constitutionalism is key. I think Tim Becker's book is really useful and interesting, but I think it tends to kind of stay on the surface of very well-known Black male kind of legal thinkers. And I think if you dig below the surface, you find all sorts of contestation. And so I think his book is important, but other work that complicates that narrative is also important.
Thanks, Tara. I really enjoyed it. So we are already over time. Unless anybody else has a very pressing question, I will bring the seminar to a close. Again, thank you for sharing your time with us and sharing your work. And thank you everyone for participating. I know it's an odd hour. There is another meeting, another seminar tomorrow at 1 at our usual time, where we continue to talk about land and early 20th century native infrastructure. Our colleague Dr. Thuto Thipe is going to present. So if you have time, please join us.